Imagine being a Japanese soldier back then. You've grown up in a society that values discipline, self-sacrifice, and a deep sense of honor. You're taught that the enemy, the Americans, is the polar opposite of all that. Soft, decadent, and dependent on their machines. But as the war unfolded, these ideas started to crack, exposing the complexity of the foe they faced. Today, we're diving into how the Japanese soldiers really viewed their American counterparts, and how propaganda, culture, and brutal reality shaped these perceptions. The Japanese military didn't leave opinions of their enemies up to chance. Soldiers were handed manuals like, "Read this and the war can be won." The title sounds almost comically self-assured, like a modern self-help book. Inside, it wasn't just motivational fluff. It laid out how Japanese soldiers should see Westerners, including Americans. One section flat out stated that Americans were cowards. Another claimed, "Our enemies are afraid of combat, more so than even the Chinese soldiers we fought before. They rely on piling up tanks and planes to win, but their hearts aren't in the fight." At first, many soldiers probably bought into this narrative. Why wouldn't they? The early victories in places like the Philippines seemed to confirm it. Americans retreated under pressure, and Japanese troops felt unstoppable. But propaganda has a funny way of colliding with reality and losing. Part of what Japanese soldiers felt towards Americans wasn't just propaganda, it was cultural. Japan, at the time, was steeped in values like Bushido, or the way of the warrior. Dying in battle was the ultimate honor, surrender was the ultimate disgrace, and discipline was the foundation of their military ethos. Then you look at Americans, loud, brash, and proud of their individualism. To the Japanese, this was baffling. Where was the discipline, the respect for tradition? And then there were the creature comforts, canned food, cigarettes, and even Coca-Cola. Japanese soldiers, often surviving on meager rations, saw these luxuries as proof of American decadence. This wasn't just jealousy, it fueled a real sense of superiority. If these Americans lived so soft, how could they possibly endure the hardships of war? The Japanese high command also shared this arrogance, and it led to some wild miscalculations. In March 1942, during a meeting to assess their progress, military leaders concluded, Americans have a high standard of living. If their quality of life drops, their morale will collapse. They genuinely believed that Americans wouldn't have the stomach for a prolonged war. Pearl Harbor wasn't just about crippling the US Navy. It was meant to shock and demoralize the American public into giving up. But that's not how things played out. Instead of breaking, Americans rallied. Factories churned out planes and ships at a pace Japan couldn't hope to match. And on the battlefield, soldiers proved tougher and more resourceful than expected. One Japanese officer later admitted, "We thought that we could outlast them, but their resilience surprised us. Their strength wasn't just in their machines, but in their determination." Now, let's get to the front lines. Early in the war, the Japanese had a few easy wins, but then came places like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, names that still echo with the horror of war. Japanese soldiers who once mocked Americans' courage found themselves facing relentless waves of Marines. One Japanese veteran from Guadalcanal recalled, "We killed so many of them, but they just kept coming. They didn't fight like we thought they would. They were very clever and adaptable." And then there was the sheer power of American logistics. While Japanese troops were running out of ammunition and starving, the Americans had everything. Fresh supplies, hot meals, and even medical care for their wounded. It was demoralizing for the Japanese. A particular target of Japanese propaganda was the US Marines. Stories circulated amongst Japanese soldiers painting the Marines as not just ruthless but monstrous. Soldiers were told that Marines were recruited from the worst corners of American society, prisons and mental asylums. The propaganda didn't stop there. It was said the Marines would kill Japanese captives, mutilate their bodies by chopping off arms, and then impale them on stakes as warnings to others. These tales weren't just exaggerated, they were designed to instill terror and fortify the resolve of Japanese troops to never surrender. One Japanese soldier later reflected, "We feared the Marines because of what we were told. They were said to be beasts, not men. We braced ourselves to monsters, not soldiers." The irony was that these exaggerated depictions often backfired. Instead of breaking morale, they heightened the anxiety of soldiers facing American forces, especially as the brutal realities of war started to unfold. The Japanese disdain for surrender wasn't just cultural. It shaped their treatment of POWs. In Japanese society, surrender was seen as dishonorable. Soldiers who surrendered were viewed as weak, unworthy of respect, and even subhuman. This mindset led to brutal treatment of captured American soldiers. During the infamous Bataan Death March, thousands of American and Filipino prisoners were beaten, starved, and killed for simply falling behind. Japanese guards saw it as a duty to punish these dishonorable captives. One Japanese guard later reflected, "We were taught to see prisoners as animals. They were beneath us, not soldiers anymore." This harsh view extended across the Pacific, where POW camps became sites of unimaginable suffering. Starvation, forced labor, and execution were routine. To Japanese soldiers, it was just another part of the war. As the war dragged on, Japanese soldiers began to respect their American adversaries. One striking example came after the Battle of Okinawa. Despite the brutal fighting, many Japanese soldiers who were captured alive were shocked by how well they were treated. An officer later reflected, "They didn't kill us like we were told they would. They fed us, treated our wounds, and it was not what we expected." This grudging respect didn't erase the bitterness of war, but it added a layer of complexity to how Japanese soldiers viewed Americans by the end. So, how did Japanese soldiers view Americans during World War II? At first, they saw them as weak, cowardly, and decadent. Propaganda painted Marines as savage beasts, while American soldiers, luxuries, and pragmatism were mistaken for softness. But as the war unfolded, these views evolved, shaped by the harsh realities of combat and the undeniable strength of their enemy. This story reminds us of the dangers of dehumanizing our adversaries and the way war distorts perceptions. It also shows us how even in the darkest times, there's room for understanding and reflection. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, as it will help the channel make more and better videos.